Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Upgrading to Drupal 8. I'm Miles Davidson, hosting for today. I'm a practice director here at Invica. And in fact, my journey with Drupal started in 2007, where I first met Nick Abbott, one of today's speakers, but we'll get to him soon enough. Before we kick off, just a couple of quick housekeeping comments. This session is recorded and we will share this with all of you after the webinar, just to help you not to take notes. And if you've got any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A widget in your webinar and we'll hope to answer those questions towards or at the end. So this webinar, just to manage expectations, is mainly for organizations that are already on an older version of Drupal 6 or 7, probably. But even if you're not and you're looking or thinking about evaluating Drupal, then hopefully there should be plenty here for you too. And whilst I have two very technical people on the call today, this is intentionally going to be at the business end of the focus rather than technical, although I'm sure I can't stop these guys getting technical at some points. So without going into too much detail, here at Invica, we are specialists in digital product development around content management systems, e-commerce and software development, and are a digital strategy consultancy firm. And I think we're fortunate enough to count some of the world's leading organizations, such as clients from Virgin, Dreams, the bed company, Arsenal Football Club, Gap, the clothing company, and cultural icons like the National Theatre, some of whom I'm pleased to say are already using or on their journey to Drupal 8. So without further ado, let me introduce you to today's speaker. We got Richard Jones, the Chief Technical Officer at Invica, who geekily I noticed has been on Drupal.org for all of 8 years, 11 months. And we have Nick Abbott, who heads up Director of Learning at Invica, who pips Richard, making him look like a mere junior, with 9 years and 1 month in Drupal. I think it's fair to say they're both very active in the community, and they've known each other for far longer than I think either of them would care to admit. And if I may continue the embarrassment one line more, they literally wrote the book on Drupal with the imaginatively titled Learning Drupal 8. So I think it's fair to say we've got two incredibly senior and very experienced people if anyone's going to talk about the upgrade to Drupal 8, it's these guys. So my first question, however, when I was asked and we were discussing this, was that Drupal 8 itself was launched back in November 2015. So Richard, I'm going to come to you first. Why are we talking about this now?
Well, yeah, thanks for the intro there, Miles. Yeah, well, people were working on Drupal 8 a long time ago. There were some people even creating projects on Drupal 8 before it's properly released. And as it's open source, that is something you could do. However, as you mentioned, the types of projects that we do means that we needed to wait for it to be a little bit more mature. What we really needed to see was, even though Drupal 8 had been released, Drupal depends a lot on community of modules that add additional functionality, and often they need some time to mature around the core product as well. So we had to wait a little bit of time for that to happen. So what we've started to see now is probably in the last 6 to 12 months, Drupal 8 started to overtake Drupal 7 in terms of adoption, and we're seeing much more interest from our clients in Drupal 8 specifically now. It's very much an enterprise tool for us now. And as such, we just needed to wait a little bit of time for that maturity.
And Nick, I mean, do you echo this? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of training?
I do, yeah. People were holding off for a long time, but as confidence built and D8 adoption grew, we've suddenly seen a really huge increase in the demand for D8 training. Just to put that in context, the demand for Drupal 8 training in January 18 alone exceeded the demand for the whole of 2017. We still had some D7 training in 2017, but it's been exceeded. And that's not just developers, that's also quite a few site owners who want to understand what's being built for them.
And so, okay, given that, in fact, I'm going to ask both of you to just perhaps pick one or two of your favorite things about Drupal 8. And I think, Nick, from your point of view, because I know you spend a lot of time with developers and editors and other users, what's your one or two favorite things about Drupal 8?
So yeah, I have two. I have the fact that content editors have always loved Drupal. They love it from Drupal 6, Drupal 7, Drupal 8. But the big difference for me now is that developers like it too. They can quickly see how they can work with it, and they tell me very early on in the training how much they love it. This is brilliant, they say to me. The other one for me also is that I can bring in front-enders. I can bring non-Drupal front-enders into projects really quickly. So in a day and a half, I can not just get a front-ender up to speed with working on a Drupal project, I can actually teach them the anatomy and physiology of Drupal too.
And I tell you what, and it must be rewarding, with these kind of training engagements where people are able to be enabled far quicker, and they're just genuinely more excited about it.
And everybody's more excited, front-enders, back-enders, content people. There's lots of excitement around, as we'll say later on, about headless CMSs. When I show Drupal 8 newbies how they can build their content model and expose it to the mobile world in just a matter of clicks, they get really excited. And so do I.
So I can hear very, very warmly. And Richard, I mean, what do you have? Do you have one or two? What give us your one or two, if I may, favourite things about Drupal 8 from your perspective?
Well, I think for me, there's sort of one that's a feature thing and one that's more a philosophical thing. There was a whole load of stuff about Drupal 8 that was rebuilt from the ground up to looking at problems that we had in the past. So the feature thing I like the most is the fact that we've now got configuration management in core, which allows us to move all of the settings that you would put through your UI, because Drupal allows you to manage quite a lot of, in fact, everything through the UI, as well as the content. So being able to move that from your development site to your production site is probably the key feature for me. But also the fact that we've now got sort of ways of exposing our content to more than just the web. So there are lots of potential places we could be exposing content now, from voice UIs to mobile apps and that sort of thing. And we can do both of those things through Drupal.
Great. So given all the things that you and Nick has said, but again, for everyone just here on the webinar today or listening to it at some point in the future, when do you know it's time to upgrade?
Well, I guess the first thing
Richard, stick with you, Richard. My apologies. Go.
It's all right. Well, the first thing to say really with that is that you don't have to upgrade. There's no super urgency to do it this second, because Drupal 7 is still supported by the Drupal community and will be for as long as Drupal 8 exists. And when Drupal 9 is released, Drupal 7 support will stop. So, there's no super rush to do this, and it's worth thinking about it as a whole project. However, what we think is, Drupal 7 has been around for many, many years now, and a lot of the ideas and concepts were based on, some old ideas and models. So Drupal 8 has got a lot more modern framework, Symfony-based components and that sort of thing, and is therefore a much better fit for the future.
But if I heard this right, though, reading between the lines, I mean, we titled this the upgrade to Drupal 8. If I'm reading between the lines here, this isn't really an upgrade, therefore. We're talking much more about a full-on rebuild, is that right?
Yeah, I think whilst there are inbuilt migration paths from the core modules of Drupal 6 and 7 to Drupal 8, realistically, it's not the sort of thing you can just press a button and magically upgrade from one version to another. So what we see this is an opportunity to look at what's involved in the site as it is at the moment, and seeing what's available in Drupal 8, because so much of what was done before in the community or custom modules is now available in the core. So lift and shift isn't really necessarily the best option.
Well, sticking on this theme for just a moment longer, you say lift and shift. Let me upgrade you on that. But, the lift and shift, or the rip and replace, or I've even heard the burn and rebuild cycle. That's definitely something that organizations get very tired of. For the cost and the human investment alone. And you've mentioned earlier about Drupal 7 and Drupal, being supported until there is Drupal 9. But I think the key question I've got here is upgrading to Drupal 8 going to lead to yet another rebuild cycle in sort of 3 to 4 years?
Actually, for the first time, we don't think that's going to happen now. There's a very, very important change that was announced with Drupal 8, and that was to, the previous versions of Drupal. Drupal 6 was released, and it was a very long period of time whilst loads of work was being done to get us to Drupal 7, and an even longer period of time to get us from 7 to 8. And Drupal has always had this concept of no backwards compatibility between these major versions, and the reason for that was to drive on innovation. But it's understood that this very, very painful switch in major versions is not that palatable. So Drupal 8 has moved to what we call semantic versioning, which means that rather than there being a whole load of work being done in a big bang release, we're now seeing smaller iterative point releases happening, which allows innovation to happen. And the important thing with that is these point releases are backwards compatible with the previous ones. And then the theory goes that when Drupal 9 arrives at some point in the future, all that will happen is it will remove all of the deprecated or old code, and therefore it will be as routine an upgrade from 8.9 or whatever it is to 9 as it would be from 8.8 to 8.9, for example. So this problem is well recognized and has been very, very well considered. So the theory goes that we shouldn't have to go through this big major version upgrade again.
I think it's fair to say that that alone is a game changer, certainly from the business perspective, in my opinion. I noticed that you're carefully caveating that, Richard. I think that's very wise. I think we're talking about investing in a different way instead of big capital investment, more like, you're going to be investing as you develop, which for most organizations who are using digital as a mainstay of their business now has to be factoring anyway. So moving on to kind of, given that we're at the right place and we're seeing success, and for people on this webinar, what does a move to Drupal 8 look like? And sorry, Richard, it's all you at the moment. I want to come back to you and then to Nick if I can. So the question there, just straight up, Richard, what does it look like?
Well, yeah, as I said just now, there's no magic button that's going to make this happen for you. What we found is that the first thing you need to do is upgrade your teams, actually the people side of things, and also to look at the workflow of how you build sites and how you manage configuration. So that's really important. It's really important, and it's a good opportunity actually to look at the site from scratch and look at what you did before in previous versions and see which parts are now included in the core. But the most important thing really is to start with the team. Well,
I think that's a perfect segue. And Nick, when Richard talks about upskilling your teams, we're talking humans here, not cyborgs. I mean, what does that actually entail?
So I think it's important to include the wider team. I think there are three distinct audiences for training. There's the non-technical people on the project, the non-technical stakeholders who are part of the project. And that takes about a day. In one day, we can bring people from 0 to hero in terms of understanding Drupal. We can get them to understand the anatomy and physiology of Drupal, understand the project better, and understand how better to work with their team as a result. We've then got people who already know Drupal and may have known Drupal for quite a long time, so Drupal 7 developers who need a transition. And they definitely do need a transition from the old architecture to the new ways of doing things. And then we have the complete tech beginners who have never seen Drupal at all, so possibly simply developers who are interested in Drupal now, and we need to train them from scratch to heavy back-end developer level. But the syllabus is the same for all three. The syllabus is very much geared towards being delivered in transition or being delivered to beginners, being delivered in a way that's very deep dive techy for the developers, or zero code, 100% site building for the absolute beginners.
And the style of training that you do, because you've got non-technical people there, is it quite academic? Is it practical? When do people get to play with the tech?
So people often ask me when they're asking about training and inquiring about training, they say to me, well, at what point to the course do we actually get to do some stuff in Drupal? When do we actually get to play with it? And the answer is about 10 minutes into day one, and then you don't stop for 7 hours for all the days that you're on the course. It's entirely practical. It's entirely learning by doing. And by doing that, at the end of the course, at the end of a one-day course, you'll, for example, you'll leave understanding the anatomy and physiology of Drupal per se, you'll have experience building a content model and possibly rebuilding a content model, as you reiterate, and you'll take away a fully mobile site that can talk to any consumer.
Well, I know firsthand from the sorts of organisations that you've trained, this is helping adoption in both academia and commercial and public bodies alike. But Richard, the other key, there was two big themes we had here. From Nick, we just heard about upgrading your team. I know that's something you echo with the teams that you manage here anyway, but you also picked on the upgrading your workflow. So can you just dig into that just a little bit more? Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by upgrading your workflow.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mentioned configuration management as one of the marquee features of Drupal 8, for me anyway. There are many others, but it used to be, as I say, you can modify all of the settings on a Drupal site as well as the content through the user interface. But the problem with that is if you want to do that on your live production site, that's about the equivalent of trying to change the tires on a car whilst driving along the road. It's not something you really want to do. So the configuration management initiative in Drupal 8 allows you to make those changes on a different version, staging or a local version, and then move those settings up to your production site all in one go. And what it really means is that every single thing you can change in the user interface can be exported to a plain old text file, a YAML file actually, that allows you to have full control over this stuff. Now, in the old days, not that long ago, we had to rely on things that there was a lot of community effort to try and make this work. And it was actually quite difficult to do. And that's why in Drupal 8, it's been rethought as a key problem that needs to be solved. So that is what I mean by upgrading the workflow, is that the team needs to understand how that works and to move towards a place where you're making safe changes to configuration and not risking making changes in production. The other aspect to this is, we've moved on from the days where you download Drupal and you FTP it up to your web server. We're now much more talking about composer style building of applications, which is very much how all applications are built on the web these days. So again, a slightly different way of working that teams need to adapt to.
Well, I did say to everyone up front we would try and keep this in the business vernacular, but it's not got past me, Richard, YAML and Composer, but you did come up with the best analogy of the day, changing your tires whilst driving. So I'm letting that go through. And just, so great, I've got it from upgrading the workflow. There was another question we have had talking on this very topic, and it's this question of SYMFONY, which gets mentioned or has been mentioned a lot. That how the fact that the Drupal community now leverages quite heavily from the SYMFONY framework. Nick, coming to you, does this mean we now have SYMFONY developers ready to dive into Drupal 8 projects?
No. So don't make the mistake of thinking that you can go and recruit a load of SYMFONY devs and for your projects and be done with it. That might possibly be the very worst thing you could do. So while SYMFONY devs are much more likely to want to work in Drupal and much more interested in working in Drupal, they definitely need Drupal training. But they love it. They love Drupal. I'm increasingly surprised with the number of devs who say, actually, this is really good. Yeah. Almost as though they didn't expect it to be good.
Do you think there's a lot of that is just coming from legacy and what it was like to be a Drupal developer in a few years ago?
I think it is. I think a lot of developer teams will have had Drupal almost imposed upon them, and they didn't like the outdated code. They didn't like the fact that it was quite poor quality code. Mm. And now that it's built on SYMFONY components, it isn't. It's world-respected code base, and they love working with it.
Great. And Richard, a topic which I know you can talk a lot about and have given many talks on is a topic that's dominating a lot. I think it started heavily from developers talking about headless. Today we hear people talking about headless and decoupled in content management. But simply put, what does this mean?
Well, taking away the terminology, basically what we're talking about is the ability to use the content you're managing in your system in different contexts. So when this was first being talked about, it was thinking, how can we build more interactive front ends using these sort of JavaScript frameworks and that sort of thing. But more and more now, we're seeing loads of different contexts where you might be consuming the same content and managing it all in one place. And examples that we've seen are mobile applications, native applications, that sort of thing, voice UIs, things like Alexa, and also other things like museum displays and panels and that sort of thing, where you've got the same content you're managing and you want to manage it in one place but consume it in lots of different places. So we're definitely seeing a change in how, and this is not a Drupal specific thing, but how people need to manage and consume content. So we saw this really happening quite a lot now, and it's really something that's quite well baked into Drupal. That it has this capability to expose any content that you're managing through the content model as a raw API, basically raw data that you can do what you want with, as well as displaying it through the front end as traditionally you would expect.
And we're seeing a lot of, therefore, we're seeing a lot of sort of SaaS products and lightweight, I think pretty much kind of lightweight headless CMS is coming up. I mean, and Drupal itself is, therefore could be seen as quite a big legacy system. I mean, how do you think Drupal really fits into this context of headless?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing some SaaS products, software as a service kind of products that allow you to build a content model and manage your content, and they don't have even the notion of having a display medium. They're purely built to be content modeling only. So whereas Drupal is API capable, it's not API only, which these other types of systems are. So with Drupal, I think you can have the best of both worlds. You can build a traditional web front end and theme and make it look great, but you can also consume that same content if you model it nicely in your mobile app, for example. So you've got both. Whereas if you're going with a SaaS product, you've only got the content itself, which might be exactly what you want, but I think in most cases that we see, you definitely need both. So we've been able to deal with the sort of unknown consumer problem, which is what I've been going around talking about for the last sort of couple of years, and exposing the content in a very standardized format that's now becoming a standard across the industry. Things like JSON, you might have heard a bit. The JSON API format is an example of that.
Great. I think that's really one of the nicest ways I've heard this whole topic described. Thanks, Richard. And having run several webinars before, one of the feedbacks we often get is around top tips, real takeaways that people can have. So I'm going to kind of flip-flop between Nick and Richard in the order I choose, but I'm really good if we can just get that essence of the lessons learned, Richard, from your lens on oversight, engineering, architecting Drupal sites, and Nick obviously from the training. I know we've talked about it a fair bit, but let me start again, Nick, with you. Your top tip when it comes to the right team.
I think once again, my top tip is to make sure you've got the right team. If you don't have the right team, it backfires, and it backfires badly and quite quickly. Don't think that you can learn D8 on the fly as you go. You'll incur a massive amount of technical debt, because untrained developers will inevitably, with the best will in the world, invent things they don't need to invent. And I've trained many teams over the years that have said to me, thank goodness we've had this training now. We're so glad we haven't started the project yet. Now we can rethink things. Now we understand this better. So it's all about getting ready for your project before you set out on the project. Perfectly put.
And Richard, I think you coined the phrase once with me that checklists save lives, or that's the pilot adage. But what is it? What's the kind of thing that needs to be on your readiness checklist?
So yeah, we had this readiness checklist when Drupal 8 was released, and we were suddenly seeing either internal or external people saying, "Oh, is it time to upgrade? Is it time to upgrade?" We ended up building this thing, a readiness checklist, to say we are only ready to start using Drupal 8 when all of these things have happened, and it depends on the site you're upgrading from. But what we're seeing here is, how much of what was custom before or what was community before is now in core. and then being ready to support a workflow for configuration management as well. So again, some things not to do with technology, but more about fully understanding where you're migrating from.
Great, makes a lot of sense. And lift and shift, I come up against it. I see this in the business area where people talk about this as being an approach. But I think, Nick, this is one of your big ones. You're not on the fence about this, are you?
Definitely not. No, absolutely don't lift and shift. It's harmful. It limits what your new site can do from the very beginning. It restricts innovation, and we've just got much better and more exciting, more powerful ways of building the functionality that we may have done before. So don't plan for your new Drupal 8 site to be the same as your old site, or even necessarily do exactly the same things. We can do better, more exciting, and much more content future-proofing. We can implement much more content future-proofing features nowadays. Don't think Drupal 7 and what your Drupal 7 site did.
And Richard, I think to you on the MVP approach, I think in the agile terminology, it's the minimum viable proposition, but I believe you're pushing the V for value here. What are you saying about MVP and value?
This sort of follows on from what Nick was saying, actually, in that, when you're looking at building a new site or moving from an old site, it's looking at, you don't necessarily have to do everything you did before. It's always about revisiting features and content and looking at, first of all, what are the most efficient and easiest ones that you can get across. But more importantly than that, understanding how valuable they are to your users. And that may have changed since you last built your site. So testing features, learning about how users are interacting with them to define which ones are the ones to spend effort on. Some of them might be easy wins, but some might be difficult. And if it's difficult, let's understand whether it's really worth that effort. So the same goes with content. You don't need to necessarily upgrade all of your, to migrate all of your content. We've definitely found projects where there was content that had been a lot of investment of time in not only creating, but maintaining. And then to find that no one's actually looking at that content, you really need to look at what the goals of your users really are.
Great. And on the topic of content, again, perfectly putting for Nick, top tips for content modeling.
Yes, I'm going to build again on what Richard just said about content, and think about content. Think long and hard about your content architecture. Think about not just the people that are going to want to consume it, but also think about the machines that might want to consume it. Because actually building your content model is so simple now in Drupal 8. You can afford to spend time getting it right and thinking it and rethinking it. I think take advantage of Drupal's new API capabilities, which will enable you to break down content into reusable components that we can use across all sorts of multiple devices. Take your time over that. It's so easy to do. And the other thing is, a very basic one, is that a lot of legacy systems around there would have had a lot of WYSIWYG content. Your content editors would have been used to a WYSIWYG interface. That has to change, because content from WYSIWYGs cannot be read by the devices that want to read it nowadays, and that's a challenge. And so the other thing I would like to highlight here, the other tip, is to make sure that you get your content editing team trialing the UX of the back end as soon as possible. Because our modern content models and the way we implement them don't necessarily fit with what content editing teams are used to doing from the days of WYSIWYG. Well,
I think you're right. I think everyone has got used to using those little buttons and having control over not just the content but the layout of the content. But Richard, in fact, the final top tip in this theme for you is what seems like the blindingly obvious, but involve people in what way?
Yeah, again, building on Nick's response there, often projects sometimes used to be IT-led, sometimes they're marketing-led, and depending on who's leading these particular projects, depends on what input we get. And it's really, really important that we understand all of the people involved in these types of projects and how they're impacted. There's no point us building the ultimate technically amazing content model in Drupal and then having the content editors reject that at the point of finishing the project because they're not, they weren't involved and they don't agree, or it's more difficult than it should be for them to do their job. So we can't assume these things, and we need to challenge and find out who was really involved in these projects.
I think that's great, and that's getting us running up to time. Although if the people on the line are happy to stay with us, please. We just have a couple of questions which seem very, very relevant. So we'll move on to a couple of questions. So the first question we have received is actually, how would you recommend moving modules from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8? Richard or Nick, whoever wishes to take that one.
I can start, I guess. Well, I think, yeah, we sort of touched on this point before. First of all, it's deciding whether you really need to move it at all. There is often, there's so much movement in the Drupal community in terms of really good solutions to problems. So what we're finding is that sometimes modules don't need to be upgraded. Sometimes there's either a core or a new way of achieving the goal. So that's one thing. Of course, if it's very highly custom, maybe specific to your business, then there's definitely a reason to upgrade that. The other approach we're seeing at the moment is because of Drupal sort of adopting this more SYMFONY component-based workflow, we might find that Drupal modules in Drupal 8 are actually wrapping around external libraries to do slightly less custom development using external libraries. So I don't know if that's directly answers the question, but it's otherwise it becomes an "it depends" answer, which we don't like much.
Yeah. Nick, I don't know if you've got anything else to add, but there was a sort of a second point to the question. You've kind of covered it anyway, but if I may just to repeat it slightly, is like, how do you deal with that, the possible absence of a required contribution? You've said, you feel like you've got 90% coverage, but you still got that must-have thing. So really, how just other ways of dealing with it when you don't think there is that contributed module that you would have relied on before?
Yeah, well, I'm really just going to second what Richard just said. In fact, there's probably better and easier ways to do what you were doing with a contrib module now in Drupal 8. So I remember when we moved from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, we probably binned 15 contrib modules because Drupal 7 did those 15 things. Same when we went to Drupal 8, a lot of the things that we were using in contrib we probably didn't need. We didn't still need them. We had ways of doing things within the core. So I think there might be an element sometimes you having to rethink how you meet that feature, but I think you'll be able to do it. I think you'll find that the flexibility of Drupal 8 is such that you can meet the feature demand.
And I would add to that to say that, if it's not there, then looking at the progress on the Drupal 8 community is important, and engaging with the community and who's maintaining that module is actually really important as well.
And I think that's a perfect way for a wrap up and say, and again, it's one of the distinct advantages of what is an incredible open source community. You're not reliant on someone else's roadmap. You have the ability to collaborate or contribute or wait. Or find another way. I think it's all options are open. So I really just want to say thank you to Richard and Nick for joining this the webinar on upgrading to Drupal 8. We look forward to sending you copies of this, and we will email everyone who has attended. And please, even after the event, we welcome any other questions, conversations, anything today that we have talked about that has sparked intrigue or interest. I'm sure I can help facilitate with our team to get Richard and Nick, the authors of Learning Drupal 8, to hopefully help you on your journey.